Chapter 12, Das Kapital. 1. Birth pangs. When Marx refused to be present at the Geneva Congress on the ground that the completion of his main work, up to the moment he had done only minor things, he thought, seemed more important for the cause of the workers than anything he could do at the Congress, he was engaged in polishing and putting the final touches to the first volume. At first this final work, which began on the 1st of January, 1866, proceeded quickly, for naturally it gave me pleasure to lick the cup clean after so many birth pangs. These birth pangs had lasted approximately twice as many years as nature needs months to produce a human being, and Marx was justified in saying that probably no work of the sort had ever been written under more difficult circumstances. Again and again he had fixed a time limit for its completion. In 1851 it was 5 weeks, and in 1859 it was 6 weeks. But always the time limit had been ignored owing to his merciless self-criticism and the tremendous conscientiousness which continually drove him to make new investigations, neither of which could be shaken by even the most impatient exhortations of his best friend. At the end of 1865 the work was finished, but only in the form of an enormous manuscript which could have been prepared for publication by no one apart from himself, not even by Engels. From January, 1866, to March, 1867, Marx turned out the first volume of Capital in the classic form in which we have it today, as an artistic whole from this tremendous mass of material. It was a feat which bore eloquent witness to his magnificent working capacity. For the year and a quarter in which it was performed was troubled by chronic ill health and even really dangerous illnesses, such as the one in February, 1866. By an accumulation of debts which threatened to overwhelm him, and not least by the wearisome preparations for the Geneva Congress of the International. In November, 1866, the first bundle of manuscript was sent off to Otto Meissner in Hamburg, a publisher of democratic literature who had previously issued a small work of Engels on the Prussian military question. In April, 1867, Marx himself took the rest of the manuscript to Hamburg and found Meissner a decent fellow. Short negotiations proved sufficient to settle all the arrangements. Marx was anxious to remain in Germany until the first proofs arrived from Leipzig, where the book was to be printed, and in the meantime he visited his friend Kugelmann in Hanover, where he was most hospitably received. He spent a number of pleasant weeks with Kugelmann and his family, and afterwards referred to this period as one of the happiest and most agreeable eases in the desert of life. His good spirits were certainly heightened to some extent by the fact that he was treated with respect and sympathy in educated circles in Hanover, treatment to which he was unaccustomed from such quarters, and on the 24th of April he wrote to Engels, "You know, we too have a much better reputation amongst the educated bourgeoisie than we thought." And on the 27th of April Engels answered, "I have always felt that the damned book on which you have worked so long was the real reason for all your misfortunes and that you would never be able to overcome them as long as you had not shaken it off. Its incompletion dragged you down physically, intellectually and financially, and I can well understand that you feel a different fellow altogether now that you have finally got rid of it, particularly as you will find when you come back into the world that it is no longer quite so depressing as it was." And for himself Engels expressed the hope that he would soon be able to emancipate himself from this damned business, because so long as he was in it up to his eyes he would be unable to do anything worthwhile. And now that he had become a partner in the firm the situation had grown worse owing to his increased responsibility. On the 7th of May Marx wrote, "I firmly hope and trust that by the end of the year I shall be a made man. At least in the sense that I hope to be able to reform my financial situation thoroughly and stand upon my own feet finally. Without you I could never have finished my work, and I assure you that it has always been a weight on my conscience that you have had to waste your splendid abilities in commercial affairs and let them go rusty on my account, and that on top of that you have had to suffer all my miserable worries with me." As a matter of fact, Marx did not become a made man by the end of the year or at any time, and Engels had to keep his nose to the grindstone for a few years more. But nevertheless the horizon did begin to clear up a little. Whilst he was in Hanover, Marx finally paid a long postponed debt in the shape of a letter to one of his supporters, a mining engineer named Siegfried Meyer, who had been living in Berlin but was about to emigrate to America. The way in which he did so offers us another striking example of his heartlessness. "You must think very badly of me, and still more so when I tell you that your letters were not only a great pleasure to me but a real consolation in the troubled period in which I received them. The knowledge that a capable man of high principles was securely won for our party compensated me for much. In addition, your letters were always couched in such warm terms of friendship for me personally, and you will realize that a man who is constantly engaged in a bitter struggle with the world does not underestimate such a thing. Well then, you will ask, why didn't I answer you? Because I was constantly hovering on the edge of the grave and was compelled to use every minute of the time in which I was fit to work to finish my book, to which I have sacrificed my health, my happiness and my family. I hope that this explanation requires no further enlargement. I have to laugh at the so-called practical men and their wisdom. If one had a hide like an ox, one could naturally turn one's back on the sufferings of humanity and look after one's own skin. But as it is, I should have considered myself very unpractical if I had died without completing my book, at least in manuscript form. In the buoyant spirits of his Hanover days, Marx took it quite seriously when an advocate named Warnbold, a man quite unknown to him, approached him with the alleged information that Bismarck wished to win him and his great talents for the German people. Not that Marx was in the least way tempted by the proposal, and he certainly agreed with Engels, who wrote, "It is typical of the fellow's intellectual horizon and of his way of thinking that he judges everybody by himself." But in a sober everyday mood, Marx would hardly have taken Warnbold's message at its face value, for the North German League was hardly completed and war with France had been narrowly averted in connection with the Luxembourg affair. Bismarck could not possibly have risked offending the bourgeoisie by taking the author of the Communist Manifesto into his service. For the bourgeoisie had only just come over to his side, and it looked askance even at such collaborators as Butcher and Wagner. On his journey back to London, Marx had an adventure, not with Bismarck, but with a relation of Bismarck, and he related the affair to Kugelmann with some gratification. On the boat a German girl, whom he had already noticed on account of her upright, almost military carriage, asked him for information concerning the railway connections in London. It turned out that she had a few hours to wait before her train left, and Marx gallantly assisted her to pass the time by taking her for a walk in Hyde Park. It appeared that her name was Elizabeth von Puttkamer and that she was a niece of Bismarck, with whom she had been staying for a few weeks in Berlin. She had a whole army list at her fingertips, for her family supplies our army liberally with gentlemen of honor and wasp-like waists. She was a cheerful and well-educated girl, but aristocratic and black-white to the marrow. She was not a little surprised when she learned that she had fallen into red hands. However, the young lady did not lose her good spirits on that account, and in a neat little letter she expressed girlish respect and heartfelt thanks to her cavalier for all the trouble he had taken with such an inexperienced creature. And her parents also informed him how happy they had been to learn that one could still meet good men on a journey. On his arrival in London, Marx corrected the proof sheets of his book, but even this time not without a certain amount of occasional abuse on account of the dilatoriness of the printer. And at 2 o'clock in the morning of the 16th of August, 1867, he wrote to Engels informing him that the last printer's sheet had just been corrected, so this volume is now finished. I must thank you alone that it was possible. Without your sacrifices for me I could never possibly have done the enormous amount of work for the 3 volumes. I embrace you with heartfelt thanks. Greetings, my dearly beloved friend.